Washington.
Ultimately, the goal is to match up the client's private commercial interest with the public interest.
Support for this podcast is provided by Chamber of Progress. Chamber of Progress is a new center-left tech industry organization promoting technology's progressive future. It's working to make sure that all people benefit from high-tech advances and that tech companies use their power responsibly. To learn more about the Chamber of Progress, visit them at progresschamber.org.
Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
From Washington, D.C., it's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
With Joe Miller.
Joe Miller.
Alex Jones's InfoWars filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy over the weekend. Apparently, it's Chapter 11, which means they can try to reorganize, which, I don't know. Come on. Hopefully not. Apparently the lies he's been spreading all these years on InfoWars has finally caught up with him and his company over false information they've spread about the Sandy Hook shooting back in 2012, saying it was a hoax, a government plot to regulate guns. I mean, that's just disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. And some of the people, knuckle-dragging cave dwellers, I misspoke there, who believed him have been accosting the poor parents of the victims in the street. I can barely talk about it. I remember the day it happened. What the families of the victim, what have they, I can't even imagine what they've been through. And to have this guy adding on top of it, it's horrifying. And even that it even occurred to Alex Jones and his followers and his partners and InfoWars to capitalize from the suffering of these people. One thing is, no one can deny the real-world effects of misinformation and disinformation. We used to have to try and figure out how to get funding for university resources, researchers, professors, to dig deep and conduct these expensive studies to find this connection between misinformation and actual real-world effects. But it was so hard to do before social media. And now, you got folks on the internet acting a fool and giving us all the information we need. So how do you regulate that? That's the thing. We've got local tort laws going part of the way, like the defamation claims the parents have filed along with negligence claims. The founders, the writers, drafters of the Constitution never anticipated this, where pretty much everyone's got a platform except underserved communities. Biden says 35% of rural communities don't have access to reliable high-speed broadband. Still don't have it. So of course they're pissed off. That's millions of people. And so then someone like Alex Jones comes along and he becomes their hero. How do we hear the real stories? We got to get out there. So let's get serious about telling those stories. Let's get on a flight. We do it. We get on flights and go to the fancy places, right? So let's go to Pendleton County, West Virginia, or Charlotte County, Virginia. Talk to folks who don't have access to broadband. Let's do that. Hopefully it's not too late. Anyway, trying to stay positive. My guest today is a colleague of mine from the Federal Communications Bar Association's Emerging Tech Committee, which we co-chair together. He's finance partner at Wilkinson Barker Nauer, which is a leading communications firm here in DC, where he works on a variety of issues, including wireless, competition, media policies, all related to technology. And we talked about how to better align the goals of the public interest and the private sectors. Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
We have a lot to talk about today, but let's give folks a sense for your background first. How did you get started in tech policy and practicing law, and what was your career trajectory?
Well, I suppose I would start in college, where I did some sportscasting on the college radio station, and that led me to a job as a radio news reporter in New York City, where I know you're from. So I did that for a little while and then went to law school and faced a choice coming out of law school whether to pursue journalism or law. And so communications law seemed like kind of a natural blend of those two things. And I practiced that for a while, got involved in politics in the 1992 Clinton campaign. That led me to a job in the White House and then at the FCC. And then in 1998, I joined Wilkinson Barker Knauer, my current firm.
Now, you started in radio. You know, I started in radio. Which station were you with?
WXLO FM. 99X, as it was known back then, well, the late 70s, I'm dating myself. It was the sister station for WOR, which was an AM powerhouse news station, but we had a 4-person news staff on the FM side. And I was the reporter who ran around New York City with a tape recorder and a microphone and interviewed everyone from Senator Ted Kennedy when he was at the UN one time to picking up their dog's poop as a result of the new pooper scooper law. So that was a really fun job. Yeah.
WXLO. Awesome. So now tell us about what you do exactly. What does it look like? What should people know about lawyers working in the regulatory space? What do you do exactly? Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, so my practice has a lot of different facets, I think, owing to the fact that I've been doing it so long and have the government experience. But on the regulatory side, it's really interesting because it has sort of a traditional legal component, but economics and politics also come into play. And so you sort of have to be agile and figure out with your client what the most effective strategy for achieving a certain result is with the government. My view is that for lawyers practicing, really any lawyer, not just the regulatory space, it's important for attorneys to ask questions of their clients and listen to the answers and really be patient and make sure you have all the information you can about the client's interests, because that's the best way you can advise them. Ultimately, the goal is to match up the client's private commercial interests with the public interest that the government is always concerned with advancing.
So it's interesting to hear you say that, this notion of not just being blind to how these policies affect real people. I think sometimes, it's often in Washington, folks, I think from outside the Beltway, just assume that lawyers and lobbyists don't really care about their interests. So it's encouraging to hear you say that. But you're not a lobbyist, you're an actual practitioner.
Right. We don't go up on the Hill and lobby Congress or anything, but we do a lot of work with the executive branch agencies and independent agencies like the FCC.
So what does that look like in practice for you? Like, what's your day-to-day?
Well, I mean, the nice thing is my every day is different, and every client's particular situation is different. So in the regulatory realm, sometimes it's simple. We just our client wants a certain result in a proceeding that is going on in the government. They're going to make a decision, and we advocate on their behalf and let the chips fall where they may. But often there's a lot of nuance and shading and small differences in how a regulation is adopted can make a big difference to a client's bottom line. So sometimes the client's interest is best served when I can help them understand what the government is thinking in terms of where they're going. And if it looks like they're definitely going there, helping the client understand how best to adjust to that. And sometimes we're convincing the government that where they think they want to go isn't actually where the public interest lies. So every situation is different.
And so what happens in that situation? Can you give us a hypothetical situation where what your client wanted sort of ran up against the public interest in such a way that it created almost I don't know if you want to use crisis as the word. How did you navigate that?
Well, this kind of happens all the time because the government is always doing things that private industry doesn't necessarily want them to do. But large companies and even mid-sized and small companies are kind of used to having to adjust to government regulation. But it seems like there's always times when, maybe it's not a crisis, it's kind of more of a normal state of affairs when you're trying to get the government to fix a problem or, adopt a rule that will enable the industry to operate more efficiently or whatnot.
Let's turn to today's trends. I mean, you were there for the 96 Act. You were there for, I hate to even say net neutrality because I start to have, the trauma starts to come up. But what are sort of the high level trends you're seeing in the tech policy debate these days? And where do you see things heading?
Yeah, so, tech policy is obviously taken center stage in a lot of the debates in the TMT space, tech, media, and telecom in Washington. And I think we're at the beginning stages of grappling with how, as a society, we ought to address the role that technology has assumed in our lives over the past 15 or 20 years. Tech is way more central to societal changes that we're seeing than it ever has been before. For example, look at the central role tech is playing in the war in Ukraine with platforms being shut down in Russia. You mentioned the 1990s when the 96 Act was adopted and Section 230 was adopted. Government's general attitude toward tech was positive. Tech increased productivity, created new jobs. That attitude seems to be changing as more focus is being brought to the effects on society of the business models that tech companies have used to build their platforms. People seem to be a lot more concerned about giving away their data to platforms who then monetize. In my view, the rise of tech platforms has been a net positive for the world, but, and social media has connected people in ways that have never been possible before. But it's also given each person the ability to live in their own bubble, choose their own views, have their own version of events. And we've lost a shared set of facts that has kind of held our society together. And the effects of having the liability shield provided by Section 230 has amplified hate speech and fueled polarization. I also think about the quote from the biologist E.O. Wilson, who said that the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. The business model that prioritizes engagement above all else preys on our emotions. And our government institutions, especially here in the U.S., are not well equipped to effectively address any harms from that. As for where we're heading, these are complex issues and there's no one size fits all solution. The term tech platform, for example, doesn't just mean one thing. There are tech platforms that offer shopping and delivery services or cloud services, and they're very different from social media or search platforms. And we need to look at them differently from a regulatory perspective, I think.
Thinking about, what must have happened when the Gutenberg press was invented and what that must have been like and how folks during that time were saying, hey, this is opening up a world of opportunity for folks with movable type and now we can produce books and anyone can enjoy them. Anyone can become an author. And it's just the scale that it can be done now.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned Gutenberg. I've read Tom Wheeler's book, From Gutenberg to Google, where he describes network revolutions, the printing press being one, the rise of industrialization and the railroads being another, and the current tech revolution being the latest. And all of these revolutions are disruptive. And it takes a while for society to adjust to them. And I think we're in the middle of that with respect to the tech revolution. Clearly a lot of good has come from tech, just in general. All of the democratization of expression. Anybody can have a platform. They can put their views out there. That's great. But in my view, the business pleasure, and I should say, by the way, that the views that I express here are mine alone and not my firm's or any of my firm's clients. I wanted to get that out there. But, to the extent that these platforms take that content and feed it back to people, the business model is engagement. To drive digital advertising. That's how they make their money. And, there's nothing illegal about it. It's been allowed to go on, and it continues to go on. And I'm not sure whether it will continue to go on, but there's some pushback now. But the whole algorithmic amplification of your own policy predilections back to you tends to drive us all into our corners and part of just the overall polarization of society. And I worry about it.
Yes, it is very disconcerting to say the least. And there's a lot of fear out there as well, a lot of uncertainty. You can feel it.
It plays into the whole, the rise of authoritarianism around the world and the threats to democracy. That's what the authoritarians want, a fractured society. That's where they can do their best work. And so, we face unique challenges here in the United States because we have the First Amendment, and the First Amendment protects speech, and the platforms themselves have First Amendment rights. So that's one of the challenges that I think we as a society need to deal with.
And the way our leaders behave plays out in pop culture. Vladimir, I wonder if Will Smith would have gone on stage and punched Chris Rock in the face if Vladimir Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine.
I don't know. That's a new take. Yeah. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah.
It was a bad situation all around. And it worries me that if people say, well, he was just standing up for his wife, you're kind of normalizing using violence in response to words.
Yeah.
And to me, that's never okay.
Yeah. So what are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and tell us where we can find you online?
I was listening to a podcast recently with Bill Walton, the great pro basketball player, who I think learned a lot of his life philosophy from UCLA basketball coach John Wooden, who said, bad times can make you bitter or better. And, John Wooden didn't draw up plays. He just let the players play and be their best selves. And he inspired them to be their best selves. So we talked a little bit about how hard it is to be optimistic about the world these days. But I try to keep in mind that you can be in a bad mood about what's happening, but still have a positive mentality and just keep on keeping on and do some small thing every day to make the world a better place. You and I sit together on a committee for the Federal Communications Bar Association, the Tech Bar, on emerging issues in tech. And my involvement in that grew out of exactly that sort of notion that I needed to do something to, play a role in bringing reasonable, rational discussion to some of these issues we've talked about today. So that's what I'd like to leave folks with is try to figure out a way to make a positive contribution every day and don't be bitter.
And try to find a way to be rational every day.
Indeed.
That's what I need.
As for where to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn or at my law firm, Wilkinson Barker Nauer. That's WBKLaw.com.
John Cohen, finance partner at Wilkinson Barker Nauer. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining me.
Washington Tech.